Ben Witherington is currently at Asbury, which is the flagship seminary for the Baptist Church. He's actually a Methodist. He claims the denomination, the United Methodist Church. He's very prolific. He's authored over 40 books. He's published probably about 200 articles. He's been on television, on radio. He's spoken at about 120 churches. Very, very, very bright New Testament scholar, Ben Witherington. The reason we bring these guys to you is because guys that have an enormous amount of scholarship behind their name but don't agree with the minority of liberal scholars, that say, New Testament is something you can ignore, the Bible's kind of just a book of mythology, this sort of thing. We want to bring you these guys to say, so if you're watching one of these things with a family member or something, you say, well, gosh, why don't we get somebody like a Witherington or a Lacona, or a N.T. Wright, for goodness sake. These are household names in biblical studies, but they just don't happen to be deeply skeptical about the Bible. So that you'll be able to not only know their names, but you could go and go to Amazon. His latest book is about the image of God, and how the image is expressed in the Bible, and very, very interesting. It's a 2-volume set, but he's actually readable. He's not too academic that it's unreadable. He separates categories of high-end academic stuff and then lay-level stuff. So if you're interested, you can't go wrong with Ben Witherington. I've never read a bad book by Ben Witherington, but he's an excellent New Testament scholar. Any questions about Witherington? He's taught at Duke. He's, which again is kind of being in the lion's den these days. But Duke, as you know, Duke University has Methodist roots. That's like most universities in our country, started with an emphasis on Christ and the kingdom of God, and now is largely compromised. But he's taught a number of places. He's an adjunct now at Houston Baptist University. Very, very, been on NBC, CBS, ABC. He's been all over the place for those sort of things. And I can remember I was immediately turned off by him at the first time I saw him. I'd read him as an author, and the first time I saw him in person was at a conference, and he had those shades on inside. You know me, with somebody wearing shades inside, I'm not really, don't really like that, right? You think you're a celebrity or something, but he has eye problems. So yet again, Joe had made a horrible estimation of what was going on. So he has eye issues, and the light does affect his eyes. So that's Ben Witherington. So if you have any questions or you want to look up his stuff, he's got some really, really, really good stuff online. The first book I read by him was one on Jesus, What Have They Done with Jesus, by Ben Witherington. An excellent book, but a really good counterblast to the really skeptical New Testament sort of approach to things. So just to give you a catch-up from last week, we are attempting to do a series on what the Bible, how the Bible's played out with regard to happiness, depression, and anxiety. And if the Bible gives us anything more specific than prayer and reading it. That's a big deal, especially given the fact, I don't know if you know this, but we've had a massive increase in the number of people that say they are very unhappy, deeply depressed, addiction-prone, and have anxiety. Last week we did a lot of qualifiers and said we're not trying to put out a version of Christianity that's just self-help. I don't know if you felt that from the pulpit with Pastor Betzer. He's extraordinarily against that notion that this is just for you to have a good life. He's against that. But on the other end of the spectrum, if we are God's children, then applying His word and being disciples, becoming disciples of Jesus, might result in being socially ostracized or social negatives. But it should make you, right, a more fulfilled person, a more peaceful person. Those fruit of the Spirit that are supposed to be developed post-conversion that we see in Galatians 5. So progressively. So what we said was, all right, further, is there anything in the psychological world that would match the biblical data that psychologists have inadvertently offered to their patients that ends up being biblical application, but they just don't call it that, and ends up working for their patients. So we're going to look at that. And last, it's to also support this idea, that the idea that over the last about 6 years, there's been a revolution in psychological studies with regard to Christian faith. And it's been a radical revolution. We compared it to the revolution in philosophy classes, that this entire discipline of philosophy and sociology, or psychology and sociology, is being led by the nose around back to thinking the Bible is an actual important document for human psychology and human, what they call human flourishing, happiness, well-being, a deep type of satisfaction, joy, these sort of things. That for years, psychology was dominated by the very negative idea of their father, Sigmund Freud. Freud said religion is always bad, especially Christianity, because it keeps you from doing what you want to do. It's repressive. It's stifling. It's non-progressive. And on top of all of it, it's not even true. So it's the worst kind of fiction because it makes people unhappy, depressed. So for years, psychological studies were dominated by this presupposition that any application of the Bible was stupid and repressive and led to all sorts of terrible, terrible outcomes, psychologically and personally, existentially. So we're going to look at what the Bible says about these things, and look at what even psychologists that don't take the Bible as seriously as we do, what they've said about it. We looked at the work of Philip Cushman, and we're going to continue looking at the work of Philip Cushman this week. And one of the reasons we're going to look at Philip Cushman is because, one, he's not a believer. At least I don't think he's a believer. And two, his analysis of the situation we're in today seems to match the reality we find ourselves in which we find ourselves. So one of the things we said was he was describing this concept called the empty self. The empty self. That doesn't mean you don't have a soul. It doesn't mean that you're walking around naked. What it means is that there are certain things that were more commonly found in the mental framework of people prior to, say, the last 20 years that just don't seem to be there anymore, or there's an acceleration of some of the more negative aspects of human psychology. We talked about him saying that there's an infantile sort of approach to life, that don't want to grow up. There's an extraordinary emphasis on youthfulness. We talked about that last week. And then we had him break down what he meant by infantile into different categories. We looked at an infantile person as someone that celebrates minimal accomplishment, somebody that's really exceedingly excited about things that were largely just givens. We talked about a person that literally wants instant gratification. They have to have it right then, right there, right now. If not, they're going to obsess over it until they get what they want. We talked about these things, and we had a pretty good discussion in the class about those sort of things. So I wanted to bring you another person besides Cushman that agrees with this assessment of some of the things we're dealing with. And if nothing else, just think of it this way. How hard would it be to preach, teach, or parent an empty self? Very difficult. In fact, what traditional parenting used to be is to try to build habits into your child that would help them avoid these psychopathologies. Pathos is deeply negative or sad. Psycho has to do with your mind, psychopathologies. So I wanted to give you this sociologist who's not a believer. He's an Orthodox Jew, but he's a very well-known psychologist based in the North named Howard Epstein. The old model for ambition was solid hard work that paid off over time. The old model was solid hard work that paid off over time. One began at a low wage, worked one's way up through genuine accomplishment, grew wealthier as one grew older, and with luck retired with a sense of financial security and pleasure in one's achievement. But the new American ambition model features the kid multimillionaire, the young man or woman who breaks the bank not long out of college. An element of adolescent impatience enters here. I want it now. And then also an element of continued youthfulness. So you can see it's not just, I could add about 15 or 16 other quotes from people that aren't believers that say, okay, the infantile point that Cushman's making is a feature, a pretty common feature in our culture. Let me give you another quote that supports Cushman's work from Epstein as well. This has to do with being easily offended or hyper self-esteem. Listen to Epstein here. Political correctness and so many of the political fashions of our day, from academic feminism to cultural studies to queer theory, could only be perpetrated on adolescent minds. Minds, that is, that are trained to search out one thing and one thing only. Is my teacher or is this politician or this public spokesman saying something that is likely to be offensive to me or members of any other victim group? Only an adolescent would find it worthwhile to devote his or her attention chiefly to the hunting of offenses, the possibility of slights, real and imagined. So you can see Epstein following Cushman here and saying, a mind that is only trained to detect and react to offenses is a childish mind. And we have people in their 40s, all the way in their 40s and 50s, that the only trained thing they can do is find offenses and react to them very negatively. So you see this over and over again in some things. Like, for example, I don't know if you know, there was a move about 4 years ago on campus to get rid of the word penmanship because the word man was in it. Dead serious. It's offensive to me. I don't want the word man in there. Women's studies changed. They don't want men in the back end of the word woman, so they changed it to MYN. And then again, Cleveland Indians, Atlanta Braves. This is insensitive to Native Americans. So again, when you have this sort of increased sensitivity to any offense, what it does is it's a lowering of what we call mental resilience. I have a friend of mine who got his master's at Duke and his PhD at Marquette and now teaches at a pretty prestigious Christian university. He said, over my last decade of teaching at the college level at a pretty well-known Christian university, he said probably the alpha weakness of the young people that come through, and he was teaching everybody from 19-year-olds all the way to 26-year-olds, he said is the lack of mental resilience. The lack of mental resilience. He said there's also an obsessional thing that happens to this sort of OCD, obsessive compulsive, kind of over again. But yeah, I wanted to give you that. So again, we said this last week. If the most refined and trained aspect of your mental life is how to detect and react to offenses, then you're no brighter than a child. That's exactly what toddlers do. They're very sensitive to even perceived slights and react very, very in an exceedingly emotive way when these sort of things happen. Sorry for the picture there. The other one was narcissistic, and I think this was mentioned last week in context of Romans 1 by one of the visitors to the class last week. But narcissism is a pathological self-centeredness. It's a self-centeredness that goes beyond self-awareness and being a person that's aware of themselves. You want to have good things happen to you. There's something about honoring the life God gave you. Nothing wrong with that. Self-esteem grounded well is not a bad thing to think well of yourself. But what narcissism is a pathological self-centeredness where there's all sorts of negative outcomes because all you do is think about yourself all the time. And that dominates your thinking. How does this affect me? You see this as well in our culture about the best revenge is looking good. Physical attractiveness becomes the most important thing because the world becomes a mirror to you. We're going to look at a snippet of a video here in a moment on narcissism, but this is also a feature of an empty self, according to Cushman and Epstein as well. Again, people that are absorbed with self, I think we're getting that right. I wanted to give you this study here at the end, too, before you watch the video. This does become a particularly problematic thing for females. In a hypersexualized culture with body image issues, things like that, this can become really, really difficult to avoid. Narcissism, the idea that how I look's the most important and how somebody reacts to the way I look is literally the most important thing. My wife and I have known Christian women that were raised with just one thing they were supposed to do by their parents, just look good. That's it. And they do exhibit a lot of the lack of character as an empty self, many of them, because the only skill they ever worked on was looking good. That was it. So largely useless to the workforce, largely useless for the kingdom of God. It's a pathological self-centeredness. And I wanted to mention this study, very interesting study from the University of Michigan. About 4 years ago, the University of Michigan did what's called an empathy study with their students. And this was something given to all students. Not all students took part. But it was basically, how much do you care about someone else, right? And these group of students at the University of Michigan scored lowest than any group they had studied over a decade and a half at the University of Michigan as far as empathy, a concern and care for other people. So this is not, again, this isn't just some disgruntled guy, some psychologist named Philip Cushman somewhere just getting angry at the current generation because he's an old man. And it isn't Epstein who's kind of this disconnected. But we're finding there are studies that match this. When you poll students, their empathy levels are really quite low. And when you talk about a hyper self-esteem context, they've also done studies where they ask students, well, who's your hero? And for the first time since they've ever started asking this question about heroes, people you look up to, people to whom you want to emulate, they said for the first time they said themselves, I'm my own hero. And they even did this with students in middle school, that I'm a hero, this sort of thing. You haven't done anything. So we're kind of seeing the fruits of this hyper self-esteem scenario going on. But let's look at this just a little bit of background with narcissism and some of the psychological issues connected with it here for a moment. Okay, let me hit play here. You think pastors might struggle with that? Is that fair? Yeah.
the video showed a trend up that, and I read a lot about narcissism in my work and some of the other things I've done, and couldn't there be the correlation with what we call the snowflakes, the people that are super sensitive, being the children of this growing number of narcissistics, because they tend to plunder their children, and creating this ultra sensitivity that we're seeing now in this growing culture that many call snowflakes.
It's not just parenting too. Give you an example. Harvard University's got a new project called the Cheap Fail Project. Because they get so many of the high-end students, they're not used to failing, but now they're in a big pond. They were a big fish in a small pond. Now they're at Harvard. They're a small fish in a big pond. And so they know that, at least in the sciences, take Edison right down the road here. If 1,500 attempts at a bulb, fail, push through, all the things you learn. Sometimes failure's a great teacher. The question is, you don't want to, does somebody really want to say, hey, this university's all about failure? We love Fs. No, but a cheap fail is different, right? It's a non-trajectory changing failure that teaches. So, and that's the story. If you think about the story of the Bible, is taking human failure and judo moving into something positive by God. So I wanted to let you. I think that's absolutely correlated to parenting strategies now, and it's something seen by even Ivy Leaguers, that we're dealing with it with even the high-end students that work very, very hard, work extremely hard. They're dealing with it at that level. In other words, we need to provide them context where they can be okay with a certain level of failure to learn, because it's a great teacher as well. So I think absolutely there's a correlation. Yes.
It is in parenting, but you will see it. I teach and I see it every day. Go to Target, all the T-shirts.
Yes.
I am the best.
Yes.
I am the hero.
Yes.
I am powerful.
Yes.
I see it, and they're all wearing these shirts, and they're all
Inordinately individualistic, self-centered. YouTube, iPhone, iTunes, I, you, me. It's marketable too, right? It's commercially lucrative. So very, very interesting. And what does the word say? Deny yourself, take up your cross, follow me, right? That's Jesus. Those are Jesus's words. So I also would say this. I don't think people in our profession do enough of this reflection and watch out. I can't tell you how many times in the New Testament, you hardly hear it preached upon, that Paul, James, John warns, right? Who were Jesus' particular enemies in the first century? Were the people that had the most religious knowledge and were given all sorts of accolades, right? So they didn't do enough reflection on their own sinfulness. They didn't do enough reflection on the fact that they're fallen. They believed their own hype. I think this is also can be said of, if you think about it, if you're a worship leader. Is that fair? You're constantly in the spotlight. You're constantly hearing accolades. So to center yourself and not let the poison come through and that sort of thing, it's interesting. One last study I want to bring you as well. One of the more current studies out of New York University, done by Jonathan Haidt, is on the negative effects of social media, especially for young girls. He said, believe it or not, instantaneous, there's a negative with having instantaneous communication. There's a positive to it, too. You remember, in a fallen world, everything's trade-offs. There's no clean solutions this side of eternity. But that's not so bad to text somebody and do instantaneous. It creates a person that has a hard time with perseverance and patience. That's another theme you don't hear preached upon a lot. It sounds like glorified boredom, perseverance, patience. But with girls, it's the getting ranked. That's the thing. Having a number of people rank what you said is particularly negative psychologically for females. Males as well. But this idea that I'm going to have people comment thumbs up, thumbs down, or no thumbs at all on what I've said or my thoughts, and to publicize them in that way. I used to say, if you couldn't make it on the big screen, you always do what? You go to the small screen television. Now we got the smallest screen called YouTube. Right? Anybody can upload something and become a overnight celebrity sensation. Another aspect of the empty self that Cushman points out is a passivity, and it's interesting because the last part of the second third of Cushman's book is him dealing with the fact that you get two different types of empty self. Somebody who's inordinately busy, and usually busy with empty things. I got to do this and this and this and this and this. They can never stop. They got a motor on their back. But he said there's also this deployment of the empty self who's extraordinarily passive. The basement dweller. The couch potato becomes the hero of the empty self. Passives are people that prefer to let everyone else do their working for them in every area. So, for example, when I watch a basketball game, those athletes have trained and now are playing the game for me, and I'm going to live through them. The pastor does my Bible study for me, or my priest, right? I let my parents are the ones that go out and work, so I can live in the basement. That's the idea. So the news media does our topical thinking. I mean, I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but what constitutes deep reflection, say, in a television medium? You ever thought about this? We're going to give a lot of time to this topic. That's maybe 90 seconds, right? And how it doesn't look like very good TV to do this and go, man, that's rough. You know, I gotta think of that's a complex thing you just asked. Instead, it's a soundbite. It's one quick return and that sort of thing. So, interestingly enough, one of our primary forms of media ingestion doesn't encourage deep thinking. It doesn't encourage solitude or reflection. It doesn't encourage the sort of things that that the Bible encourages us to partake in. Tech addiction's also part of this thing that, I can let this think for me, right? Google's my second brain with very little reflection. And I did want to ask you what you thought about this. What do you think's a downside to having instantaneous access to moderately reliable information and a massive access to it? Do you think there's any downside? Ken, go ahead.
It's because the information is readily at your fingertips, you don't really have to go that deep into research.
Very true. So it encourages a shallow reflection on it. Okay. Anybody else? What do you think? Instantaneous access to massive information? Yes.
Well, Google in their bias is going to tell you what you want, what they want you to know, not what you really, the truth.
Yes, the prime culprit being Wikipedia, which again, as a project, sounds ambitious and incredible, right? But there's a reason why you can't cite it in papers at a college. In most colleges, the gatekeepers aren't even professional scholars and things like that. So you can get basic information, maybe when they were born, when they died, very basic. But anything deeper than that is going to be likely compromised, even with that very ambitious open source encyclopedia project. Anybody else? The idea that massive amounts of relatively reliable information is available at your fingertips. Anybody else got anything you think could be a social negative or a? How about it? Yes.
Yeah, I think it fosters the attitude of just lackadaisical attitude that you can become easily brainwashed and be led down a particular path by social media if you fail to do your research.
Sure. Yeah, I agree, and you don't really get a lot of both sides either. You don't really get a reflection on the best argument against and for and that sort of thing. In fact, that was the impetus behind this website called Best Schools, where you have people on both sides of the issue where the student can reflect and go, okay, here's the best arguers on both sides, and this is where I come down on this sort of thing. So that was the idea, at least, behind that. Listen to Epstein here again on tech addicts. Television comes closer and closer to being a wholly adolescent form of communication. Clicking the remote from major network news shows, one slides smoothly from superficiality to triviality. When Tom Brokaw announces that some subject will be covered in depth, what he really means is that roughly 90 seconds, perhaps 2 minutes, will be devoted to it. It's scarcely original to note that much of contemporary journalism, print and electronic, is pitched to the short attention span, the soundbite, the photo op, the quickie take, the deep distaste for complexity. In short, it's pitched to an adolescent temperament. The average attention span of someone under 20 years old is about 11 minutes, and that's pressing them. You know, when I used to have to teach, I used to have to do a 90-minute run with people under 20. I mean, it's like a magic trick. And then I don't know if you know, people over 20, it's about double that. It's about 22 minutes. That's why the sermon's about 25 in the big house. Did you have something to add? Yes.
Candace Owen, she's a new conservative who's rising, and she started on YouTube. She said she designed her presentation to not be any more than 4 minutes because she was trying to reach a younger crowd. And she said if you don't get it in the first 4 minutes,
I'll give you a great example too. Another well-known conservative pundit was trying to do something about how almost all the universities are starting to become compromised. Is Dennis Prager, and he does PragerU vids. And at first he said, all right, let's get the best and brightest thinkers to do about a 30-minute. They'll have to summarize their points in like 30, and they're never going to watch for 30 minutes. And so they did literally 3 years of market analysis before they put their initial seed of $2 million toward this project. And they said, okay, it can't be more than 6 minutes, and it has to be highly, highly interactive with artwork and moving pictures. I can tell you this, I've had students react negatively to seeing that much text on a screen. Like a scared reaction. Now that's a social phenomenon that's really unique, right? That much text on a screen is like, bah. So I've had people tell, I probably one of the most common complaints is that the Bible isn't in a movie form. Like the whole Bible isn't in a solid, like biblically based movie form. So yeah, you get this sort of thing. Now, go ahead, Ken. Yeah.
I was going to say, just before you move off of that, I heard a phrase coined, which was a perfect phrase about this very particular topic, called snackable content.
Yes.
So
Yes.
all of our content these days needs to be snackable.
Very short, very succinct. Yeah.
It's just saying it's so
Yes.
bad.
Right.
Yeah.
And part of that, let's be honest, part of that is just a passive habit formed. You think about the average television watch. An average sitcom's only about 21 minutes. Every about 8-9 minutes, you're separated into little mini narratives called commercials, right? Where now you have a radically new story 3 times in a row, and then now you're supposed to come back. Yeah, now we're back, right? Even HGTV, right? You go into homes, I think they average something like almost triple digits of angles. Like you can't walk into a room and just have a steady shot of a room. It's always a new angle, always, and then edited for, So yeah, part of that is just being passively trained to only have an attention span that only lasts till, all right, now it's, even if you're watching a sitcom, right? You're watching a sitcom, and then now all of a sudden I got to think about the King of Beers. What did he say? No, then I've got to think about a new pharmaceutical item that has more negatives than the positives that it gives you. And then I've got to also think about McDonald's. And then I got to go back to my narrative. Yeah.
And that's exactly why professional speakers, the best professional speakers, even Pastor Betzer and our youth pastor, when you listen to them, about every 5 to 10 minutes, they're going to tell a joke or they're going to ask for audience participation to keep them locked in.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Hard to make a run like that without some sort of a something. In fact, it's even gotten some like one of the teachers with whom Chris and I worked at our high school was a woman that had gotten 2 National Merit Awards for teaching. And what she did is she took her hour, either whether it was a 55-minute block or an hour or a 90-minute block that matches college deployments, she would stop every 15 minutes to do something radically different. So they'd start and they do an interactive reading. Then they would do something like a question and answer. Then they do something where they acted it out. Then they do a shadow box. So she had, now it's enormously difficult work, but it mimicked a television program where there'd be a radical change in what you were doing every 15 minutes. So and when they got to the end, they had a general idea of what happened, but so anyway, very, very interesting. But she got awards for mimicking her classroom like a television show. So very, very interesting. Let me give you this, and I'm going to give you both sides here. Even if you go to something like The Economist, right, a magazine that's for economics majors about finances. Go ahead. I didn't want to skip past you. Go for it.
I'm not sure how this is going to fit in if you move off to something
Yes.
else. But what do you think of gaming?
Yeah.
As, a big part of the tech industry, it is huge,
Huge.
now.
It's blown up.
And I'm not a gamer, so
Yes.
I don't know how it runs, if they have to break it up or
Right.
not.
Yes.
But I was flipping through a magazine yesterday, I was in a showroom, and I did not realize
Yeah.
that there is all this going on in the world of gaming.
Yes.
And they are really making a concerted effort to get females into it.
Absolutely. That's a big push now. You're right. Very interesting because I've engaged in gaming as well. But I will tell you this. Think of it like a hierarchy. I actually would rather have my child play a game than watch a movie. And I'd have them watch a movie rather than watch TV. Because at least with a movie, there's a long narrative that doesn't get interrupted. So you're not training them to be ADD, I can't pay attention, right? And with a game, it's a longer narrative that doesn't have commercial interruptions, and you're actually inputting something. You're actually interacting and doing something. Now, there's negatives that come with that. I'm not saying it's a positive, but I do see it on a continuum like that at least you're not going to have a passive kind of... They even talk about how many people watch TV and you get to a point where you're like, you don't even care what's on. Your brain is at almost a REM sleep level, according to researchers, and you're just kind of flipping. It doesn't, hundreds of channels, just kind of, ooh. It's hard to do that in a game. It's difficult to do that in a game. So again, there's still a negative of being addicted to it with the ideas that come through that don't have a lot of that kind of match the culture. The desensitization is a big one. Absolutely. There's a lot of violence and that sort of thing. Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
One of the interesting articles I just read just on this regard was that a lot of companies are going to the gamification of training, of they're moving away from just manuals that are listing things that need to be done at certain, especially in engineering aspects. They're starting to gamify those requirements and how to learn certain programs, how to learn certain things, and they're putting them in a game format so that younger generation, and the particular examples that were being used in this article are engineers, like in a CAD-like program that was new but fairly intense, and they had gamified the entire thing, and they learned the programmers and the people that were going to be using the program learned it within I think it was 30% of the time that it took other people that didn't have it in the gamified form.
Well, it's hard to disconnect and not pay attention because you're having to tactile input things with your hands in a game. That's difficult. But that also means that how is somebody, if they can't tactile input and control Betzer, how are they going to listen to a 22-minute Betzer talk if I want to move him left and make him jump? So there's a negative that comes along with it, right? There absolutely is a negative that comes with it. They get increasingly where they can't hold, one of the negatives, deep negatives, is you get to a point where you increasingly can't control the addiction. That's all you want to do. There's no real contribution at the end of it. If you think about it, you're not training yourself to contribute in any way. And there's a difficulty in social. The only people you can socially interact with are those that play the game you play. That's another. I don't want to paint a rosy picture. There are some negative trade-off with that game, the whole gaming phenomenon for sure. But let me read you this out of The Economist of all things. This is from a PhD economist. Listen what he says here. It's relatively negative, but no, it's actually very negative. Worries about the damage the internet may be doing to young people has produced a mountain of books. Today's youth may be web savvy, but they also stand accused of being unread, bad at communicating, socially inept, shameless, dishonest, work-shy, narcissistic, and indifferent to the needs of others. Now, I want to give you a second counterpoint to this. Most people would agree with The Economist's assessment, at least with the majority of the adjectives there for millennials and iGens. Again, there's a laundry list of negatives with mine, Gen X, and with boomers. But most psychologists would actually agree with this, whether Christian, non-Christian, atheist, Jew, whatever, religious, non-religious. There is one book that's kind of the rallying cry for this millennial generation. It's Don Tapscott's book called Grown Up Digital. Grown Up Digital. He says that he interviewed over 8,000 students through about over 20 universities. And he said, look, here are the adjectives that are missing. This new generation is more playful, open, tolerant, diverse, independent, and smarter. Now, I would challenge smarter, but Tapscott says that there's an upside to this sort of thing too. Sometimes you get sociologists and psychologists that'll mix both. There's a book called Habitudes, and then another one called iGen. I think it's called iGen. What's the name of the sociologist? Tim Elmore. He actually came and spoke at our school at one point, and I had this very unique experience where I agreed with a lot of the content, but I just couldn't get through the presentation. He would, very expressive and had a really, his voice. So I just closed my eyes and tried to really concentrate because his content was awesome, but the way he presented it was just, anyway. But he's good in the sense that he combines both. He'll say, all right, here's the negative side, but here's the positive side of this generation and the opportunities there. Vilmar?
Well, it's interesting what you just said, because in part you answered my question, but I was just thinking about, the destruction of reading.
Right.
And then I thought the word engage, and then the empty. Yeah. Empty them.
Yeah.
And then I ask you, who is interested in actively, daily, disengage the whole world so we cannot respond to the humankind of greatness, positive side, with integrity, like you said, dishonesty, character, happiness. People are not happy. And honesty and self-started. In the past, until the 40s, we all were self-starters.
Yes. Initiative. Right? Yeah, I think it's all a part of you want it instantaneously too. We know character habits build over time, right? The things you want most take the longest time and are the messiest. Great relationships, having an aptitude for a job, that doesn't happen. You don't get that at McDonald's through the drive-through. It's not an app you can download, right? So you can see this sort of thing where there's the impatience, the lack of perseverance, this approach, the instantaneous. I've got it right there at my fingertips. Any comments about this largely negative summary from The Economist, but then this kind of pushback? I think a good balanced scenario would be in any generational analysis where you get a both sides, right? You try to get both sides and not just go overly negative. But I'll give you this. One of the reasons people get sleepy when they read is because it requires work and engagement. You have to go top to bottom, left to right, idea, conclusion. You have to create all the sights and sounds in your head. That's tough mental work. You have to engage a book. On the other end, a screen gives you everything. So it encourages you to sit back and get, right? The reason I mention this is because we have an epidemic in our pews, don't we? Where people are like, what did I get today? And I want everything given to me from the front of the church. You understand what I'm saying? And further, if the Bible, I mean, think about, Jesus could have done in the beginning, there was a videotape. You ever thought about why we got a book? Well, there might be something to an inscripturated word, right? Yes.
You mentioned the word book, and perhaps The Economist might be biased because they're owned by Pearson PLC, which owns Prentice Hall, which publishes a lot of books.
There you go. So, of course, they're going to say, get these people reading, right? Or we're out of business. So, but you think about even the short attention span idea. USA Today was pitched to 3 different mega publishers, and they laughed them out of the room because their pitch idea was this. We're going to write at a 5th grade level. We're not going to have anything longer than 4 paragraphs, and we're going to have lots of pictures and colors. It's the 3rd most read newspaper. Well, if you still read newspapers, a website as well. But that guiding philosophy of very shallow interaction with a lot of bright colors and pictures is kind of like television, has dominated the day. Yeah.
Well, I was going to mention, in that counterpoint,
Yeah.
the part that's interesting about it is while some of those things are positive, and I would argue with the word tolerant because the definition of tolerance today is not really what tolerance is.
Absolutely.
Tolerance in today's definition is acceptance.
Yes. Yes. Of everything.
And I don't believe that's the case, but
Sure.
kind of big argument there is the top portion of that slide is overwhelmingly the problem.
Yes. Yes.
And those things on the bottom do not negate the larger problem
Right.
that our future holds because of how those descriptions are presented.
Well, think about almost every gospel feature, and we'll end with this. A concern for others as image bearers of God. A raising of your head, as C.S. Lewis said, because God values you to put his image on you, but you're fallen. So as Lewis said, it could raise the head of the lowliest beggar, Christianity, and lower the head of the highest king. These sort of things that the Bible is largely communicated through a historic medium and a book that you can ignore it, or you can take it up and read it and try to apply it. So almost everything we've talked about has a counterpoint in the Word from the Lord, if this is a supernatural communication. The idea of patience, perseverance, having a healthy view of yourself that's both positive but also includes negatives as well, understanding where you're. Even the idea, I was reading just the other day in 1 Timothy, the idea of envy amongst leaders in Christianity is just, you don't hear a lot about it, but it's got to be talked about. Well, he's got that, I've got this, and they've got, it's always this one-upsmanship. So, trying to keep those things in check are big. And I'll tell you this, let me just we'll end this way. The pastor, I hope you all go to the main service. Chris and I were talking about this a couple weeks ago. Pastor Betzer does an astounding job of this sort of thing. I remember hearing him. I think they did a baseball field event some years ago, and a couple of the ushers said, "Can you believe how many people showed up?" And he said, "More people have shown up if I was going to hang today." That's an old Churchill line, but he was just trying to keep that accolade in place and contextualize it, right? He goes to other so you've seen Pastor, like, there's so many ways this ministry could have gone wrong with him, believing all the hype. Do you understand what I'm saying? Because he's, I mean, I'll just tell you straight up. They broke the mold after Dan Betzer. I mean, he's remarkable and wonderfully unique. But the great part is, I don't know if he believes that completely. You know what I mean? He's really, he's an incredible person under which to mentor, because he's constantly trying to find ways to qualify, even the great things said about him. Yeah, go ahead. Vilmar first, then we'll go. Yeah.
I compare Pastor Betts with the Queen Elizabeth. No.
Oh, help me.
But no, when her father
Yes.
denied the throne,
Okay.
and she took it upon herself, and she understood one thing very important, that everybody was like, millions of people were, and I remember my father in the late 50s telling this story in my home back in Brazil, and if she did understood that it wasn't about her,
Yeah.
but about the throne.
Right.
That's why England and the Queen of England is so powerful and,
Yes.
and well beloved.
I'm an employee of these people, and that means I've got things to do. It's big. It's big and very difficult, by the way, in that monarchy system to keep that in check. When you're dressing a certain way, sitting on a certain seat that no one else sits on, you know what I mean? It's hard to keep those sort of things in check. All right, well, it looks like it's 10:28, so I will pray us out. Any other questions or comments? Yeah, go, yes.
I wanted to say that we have to understand that in this cultural war,
Yes.
the media, they're not interested in converting us.
No.
They're after the next generation,
Right.
which is your grandchildren
Right.
and your great grandchildren.
Yes. Yeah.
And they will stop at nothing. I mean, when you find that 50% of kids graduating today cannot read at grade level, you have to understand that they are deliberately doing this kind of thing to keep them ignorant so that they can be brainwashed through the media to grasping their ultimate
Yes.
Easily led. I mean, if you can't communicate, you can't think, and you can't read, then you'll be a soundbite. You'll hear a sentence, you'll adopt it as your own, and then it's as thin as that sort of thing. So if you can't evaluate, you are easily led. So very, very interesting point. Let's pray. Gracious God, we love you. I thank you for my brother Juke that invited your Spirit to come be with us today. Lord, I ask you to help us take these things, and when we see things in the Word or things proclaimed from the Word here in a moment in big service, Lord, that you would be a person, God, that would come and show us, give us insights to help to forward your kingdom. It says in James, Lord, that you're a person that will grant prayers if the motivations are correct. Lord, we want the right motivations. We want the right thoughts. We want to think your thoughts after you, God. So keep us humble. Raise us, Lord, but raise us for you and your kingdom, not for our own selfish individual needs and desires. And God, help us be a light, Lord, and be people that can say, okay, this narrative doesn't work. It's not working. It hasn't worked. And by the way, there's another way, your way. Help us be people that tremble at your word, as it says in Isaiah 66. We thank you for this, God, and ask you to just be with us through the week, Lord, and not only give us insight, but give us opportunity to express the insight in a short, succinct, and powerful way by your Spirit. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, guys, we'll see you next week, hopefully. Thank you for your attention.